Hello, and welcome to 52 Weeks. This week we begin Chapter 6, which focuses on mobility. The chapter will be divided into 5 segments, and this will give us a holistic way to understand transportation planning. As the focus with the chapter is a holistic approach, the goals in this chapter are presented within particular themes that collectively create the overall transportation system. These include number 1, pedestrians, number 2, streets and circulation, number 3, vehicles and parking, number 4, bicycles, and number 5, transit. So as we continue in the mobility chapter, we're going to be looking at this segment, which is vehicles and parking. Within here, we start out looking at gateways and wayfinding. So if we're coming into the city through vehicles, any type of higher speed movement, we should have some gateways and entranceways, as well as some wayfinding markers to understand the entrance into the city. So one of the starting quotes out of the comp plan in this segment, one way to address safety and quality of life impacts is by informing drivers that they've entered Harrisburg and its urban street grid. When commuters and visitors from long distances arrive, they leave the highway and transition to the local streets. This is always an issue coming off of 83 into the ramps across Paxton and onto 2nd. You notice this transition, or cars should be slowing down to city speed of 25 miles an hour, but that is rarely the case. Similarly, drivers unfamiliar with Harrisburg need clear visual cues and signage to understand how to use local streets and to find parking. A few approaches to improving travel and parking legibility. So if we had signage that told us how many spaces were available in the parking lots and the parking garages, that would be helpful. Other cities have this. And also looking at signage that tells us where we need to go for main points of interest. We do have some of this around Harrisburg if you look at the blue signs that are around, but a lot of those are dated and they haven't really changed. It would be a great process for Harrisburg to go through and look at how visitors actually approach and transition to the city, that we can help them understand that transition. Consistent and well-distributed circulation patterns keep vehicle traffic moving at safe speeds and discourages over-reliance on one or two streets, achieving a balance between vehicle flow and pedestrian safety. This is the thing about understanding Harrisburg circulation. This should be a high-level space syntax, diagram, and also analysis, looking at our streetscape and our street network and looking at distribution. For instance, when we have Front Street that goes from 3 lanes to 1 lane, or we have 2nd Street going from 1 way to 2 ways, that changes things. And there are ways to look at that analytically to show the potential traffic patterns that may need to adjust, and also where other streets need to be adjusted for picking up any of that slack. That may be Division Street Bridge, that may be 6th and 7th Street as well. These are things that should be on the traffic planners' minds in this. What's frustrating is that the technology's out there to do this. We are almost into 2020, and this stuff is already out there with artificial intelligence and predictive car movements within computer models. We should be doing that for our city. It's not that much to do from a planning standpoint because our city scale is so small. To move beyond car ownership, when we look at the demographics and changes and interests, part of it is being able to own a vehicle, but that is changing. The idea of either owning a home or owning a vehicle has changed. Harrisburg has the appropriate concentration of people, services, and employment to embrace such services. In helping people get to and from public transit and activity centers within the city, these new transportation paradigms address first and last mile issues, making life easier for those of us who cannot afford a car, and enables others the option of car-free and car-light living. And I put a graphic in here from MIT's CSAIL, which does a really interesting traffic study of changing taxis from 12,000 to a fleet of autonomous vehicles at 3,000, and see if it can still take up the slack and actually make mobility much easier and less wait times. The Harrisburg Transportation Center must evolve into a regional nexus for multimodal transportation options and function as Central PA's primary hub for non-automotive transportation. That's a critical piece to understand. The development of the HTC into a multifaceted transportation center provides opportunities to create a thriving transit-oriented development, TOD, around the Harrisburg Transportation Center. We know that TOD is already out there as an idea and a concept, and that should be automatic. That isn't even anything new. The term transit-oriented development comes from the late 80s and 90s, and we're now just trying to figure that out. So some of the key issues to think about with vehicles and parking: the car-based mobility and access in Harrisburg is largely limited to those who own a car, or imposed to those who must drive, despite the high cost of car ownership. So if you have to travel to work, you have to have a vehicle, and that vehicle has maintenance. And the reality is that even with as walkable as Harrisburg is, the ability for one to live and walk to work is a very select few, and that's one of the things that is not even talked about in Harrisburg when we look about this idea of car ownership. This should be something that's critical, and where we push the emphasis into bus rapid transit or some sort of better transit system. We'll get to that to the latter segment. The street network was redesigned for weekday commuters to travel more easily during rush hours. The system does not thoroughly consider resident needs or compel commuters to adjust to local street once exiting the highways. So this is a really big pain in the butt. When we look at it, our streets were designed to get people in and out of the city. That's never really been adjusted. There are many cities in Pennsylvania and the nation that actually follow that. So it's not that we're unique in this, but we have the ability to begin to think about how to change that. The city's limited control over parking in commercial districts means that there could be an existing or future oversupply of parking based on land use changes, transportation network changes, and development pattern changes. So no one's really looking at land use. Should things begin to shift? This is our thing within, if we have this idea that we don't need parking, if we shift and continue to push into Uber and Lyft, and again, that's a select group of people who can use that, the idea is that then we may not need to have as much parking. But that takes a lot of convincing of people with this first and last mile. That really needs to be looked at. I think what should be called on is a huge commuter transit study that looks at first and last mile if they were given the option. This would be a good study to see is the overall transit usage. If you had if you put in a system in a computer model and test it out, would people go and use it? And it would be interesting to see how much the change would happen within the other areas around Harrisburg. Switching into the end portion of the segment, goals. Goal 3.10, support a vehicle network that balances the needs of both residents and workers. Goal 3.11, expand opportunities for car optional living for residents in the city of Harrisburg. Goal 3.12, accommodate parking demand without providing an oversupply of parking spaces. And then finally closing out with the action items. M28, work with Standard Parking to conduct a downtown-midtown parking consolidation study with the goal of centralizing parking, freeing up urban land for development, and maintaining reasonable accessibility for drivers. Action M29, work with Standard Parking, private lot owners, and neighborhood groups to provide events, activities, and alternative uses for parking lots and parking facilities during off-peak parking times, such as farmers markets and neighborhoods lacking access for fresh and healthy food. This is done a couple times over the summer with the parking lots that are turned into events that are happening over at the Hack parking lots off of Riley. I think it'd be good to see that happen with all these lots, is to think about ways to use them on off times. Action M30, collaborate with the Tri-County Regional Planning Commission, neighboring municipalities, and regional employment destinations to develop a travel demand management program. So this is going to look at commuting that's happening, how to start to balance this. This would be part of the 2040 growth management, but it has to be collaborative between these counties and municipalities. That's one of the problems we can't do. We can't do the 4 C's, people. We need to learn how to collaborate, how to communicate better, how to be creative, and also critically think. We're not there, and we need to be modeling this to our kids. This closes out one more segment in the mobility chapter, focusing on vehicles. I hope that you continue to listen to the segments of this week and find them enjoyable. Thank you very much. Take care.